Truth is, I thought it mattered. I thought that
money
mattered. But does it bollocks? Not compared to how people matter.
Welcome, Mention, and other fine folks to the Someday Dispatch of the Black Letter, where we contemplate thoughts worth thinking. And there are a few thoughts from the past week where we're going to investigate today in the inaugural Black Letter. And the first one is government, I guess, Bitcoin, and veganism. Those are the three sort of ideas we'd like to explore today. So hope you enjoy this journey with me. Let's get to it. Okay, so the first one here, as you can see, this is Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio is a hedge fund manager, as I understand it, basically of one of the biggest hedge funds in the world, and he really has his idea on the macro cycle of the economies and the world investing mechanisms and these kinds of things. So basically, this is an article he's published here at LinkedIn, and all the links will be down below. You can have a look for them yourself and read through it. It's a very long article, and he does several of these. This is the third, I believe. Here we go. Now, this first one is about the big cycles over the last 500 years. This talks about how capitalism creates debt, is used to fuel the growth of capitalist economies in the early days, but that debt can sometimes be abused to create wealth gaps, and then those wealth gaps can be seen to create unrest. And this is more of a macroeconomic article where he discusses how world economies generally rise and fall. We'll look through this here too. He's bolded most of the important aspects in bold, obviously dark black, so that it helps you to get a sense for it. You don't have to read the whole thing, but it is worth a read for sure. And here we get to the first sort of, I guess, chart, if you will. As it says here, as you can see, the United States is now the most powerful empire, but not by much. And it is in relative decline. And you can see that here as well. The blue line is starting to sort of come downhill, which is the United States, and the red line, as indicated here, is China. Now, Dalio believes that the American empire is sunsetting, if you will, and I'm inclined to believe the same, but I'm not sure that we'll see China rising and overtaking the United States in a great way. I think what will happen, in my opinion, is that the world will become somewhat more egalitarian from a superpower perspective, in the sense that I think China will rise to become more powerful than the United States, certainly, but the United States will not sort of dip down below to where sort of the last major world power, which is the United Kingdom, has dipped down to. I think what will eventually happen is that things will settle down within a much more consistent and modest area where most will have perhaps a handful of countries jockeying for power under different situations and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, this is very interesting, and you can see here some rough estimates of the relative standing of great empires. More importantly, it's interesting, this chart here seems to suggest that there's about a 200-year or so span. This one is the Netherlands. This is the Great Britain. You can see here again about 200-year span. United States will also be about 200 years, which will mean it'll be at about 450, I guess, when it'll be its height will have been completed, its cycle, if you will. And what we can see here is that the United States is well on its way to giving up the main superpower status, if you will, or the reserve currency. It's a very interesting article, and it goes on to talk about how this really happens. And I've highlighted a few portions here that we'll get to, as you can see. So as other countries become more competitive, the British Empire became more costly and less profitable to maintain, and this had happened before with the Netherlands or the Dutch guilder as well. And then as a consequence of the large wealth gaps, there become greater arguments about how wealth should be divided within countries, and secondly, greater conflicts and comparabilities in economic and military powers that existed between European countries. We've seen this, we saw it with Dutch. The Dutch had the biggest company at the time, the Dutch East India Company, and they got into great debt and sort of become full of lethargy, and things start to unravel in a society where you lose your innovation, you become complacent, I guess, in many ways. So it's just the natural cycle, if you will, of countries. That's happened to all countries, but Dalio's just dealing with countries from the 1600s, really, those that had a world currency, if you will, and the Dutch guilder was the first in that instance. And then, as is typical, the debts and wealth gaps that were built up in the 20s led to the debt bubbles that burst in 1929, which led to depressions, which led to the printing of money, which led to devaluations of currencies and greater internal and external conflicts over wealth and power in the 1930s. And we saw that, of course, across the world, and especially in the UK and then the United States. And my concern now is that we are repeating this and it's getting worse. And then that eventually led to too much debt being required to finance both war and domestic needs, and what was called guns and butter. And then because of that, the world's major currencies at that point were backed by gold, and obviously we had to get off of that because there wasn't enough gold in the world to service all the debt. So that became part of the problem. And then each of these cycles raised debt and non-debt obligations such as pensions and healthcare. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about on this specific article, but it's definitely worth a read, if you will, especially if you just read through the bold part. My concern is that we're in the current situation where governments are printing money hand over fist, and unfortunately most of it's going to their cronies. And by that I mean most of it's going to the big hedge funds, and to those who have assets, basically the 1% and perhaps even the 0.1%. And this is going to cause great problems. We've been given in the United States, for example, a little $1,200, a one-off, so thank you very much, and that's it. My opinion is that we should be giving this money to people generally. Perhaps now's the time to consider universal basic income, which I'm a fan of, as things are going to only get worse, I think, before they get better. Governments, I think, are losing trust with the public, certainly are with me, and this printing of money is very worrying from a variety of reasons. But it's primarily because as you get an over surplus of any commodity, really, and in many ways, I think money is a commodity to use for an exchange. Example of your time you exchange for goods and services. It's a sort of a commodity in that way. And when there's a surplus of commodities, if there's too many apples, then the cost of apples has to go down. So what does that mean if there's too many dollars? Well, arguably the cost of other commodities or products and goods and services that you pay with that will have to eventually go up, and this causes inflation, of course. Now, is that going to happen? It's hard to tell. Nobody knows. Many people are thinking we will. Many think we'll have deflation. I personally think we'll have some deflation first for the next year or two, and then perhaps we'll start to see inflation. The reason I say deflation at first is because I think what will happen is that people will start to hold on to their cash. They're very concerned about the pandemic we're in the midst of, and I imagine that they will start to worry about their futures, and in that case they'll save money rather than spend it. But once all this excess money starts to make a way out into the general economy, then we should probably start to see inflation. So that's something I've been thinking about, something I'm concerned about, which brings me to the next issue, which is Bitcoin. And can Bitcoin become worth $1 million US, one Bitcoin? And I think it could, arguably, quite easily. Here's a chart, as you can see, a long-term chart, and currently we're around here right now, which is at about $9,600 US or so for one Bitcoin. You can see this is a logarithmic chart as the increases step up exponentially. You can see how it started. I sort of became familiar with Bitcoin around between 2015 2017. I got in 2017 with like $100, which I since spent, and then now I'm starting to think about getting back into it just a little bit, just putting $20-30 a week into it, because the thing I like about Bitcoin is that there's only 21 million of them, right? So let's do some math. If Bitcoin gets to $1 million US, then the whole of Bitcoin in existence, which will be 21 million eventually at the maximum, and of course there's been arguably several million that have been lost and will be unrecovered regardless. Bitcoin at 1 million, even if we have all 21 million Bitcoins available, only makes a market cap of 21 trillion, which is not excessive by any means. And what that means, in my opinion, is that what you get is one Satoshi equaling 1 US cent when Bitcoin equals $1 million US. And I think that's quite easy to see. And it makes a lot of sense, if you will, because one Satoshi being 1 cent is not outrageous. Now, a Satoshi is the smallest amount of Bitcoin that's available, and one Bitcoin is stretched out to 0.8 zeros. So one Bitcoin, for example, has 8 decimal points beyond it, and that last decimal point is known as the Satoshi, the smallest amount of Bitcoin that can be found, and that would be equal to 1 cent if Bitcoin ever became worth $1 million. So I think up here is talking about 1.3 million. Down here, go with the red line, which will be the max. So we can see that if it hits the red line, we'll get to 1 million at around, where is that? Probably somewhere 2030 2030, I imagine. It used to have it on here, but here it only has the 2019. So I think this would be around 2028. I would assume that would be my best estimate around here, Sami. So I think by 2030, it's a good chance we could see Bitcoin at $1 million US. Okay, so now on to the last one. And the thing I like about Bitcoin too is obviously it's just before we finish is that it's a very risky investment, but I think it's perhaps no more risky than gold, if you will. I like to consider it as a sort of digital gold, but we'll see what happens. It's something that I'm starting to put a little bit of money in just as a hedge. Maybe 1 or 2% eventually of my net worth will be in there, and that will be my goal. Anyway, I feel comfortable with it, especially with the way the governments are just printing money as if it's going out of existence. So that's very concerning. All right. Obviously, all of this is talk in my book, but veganism is especially talk in my book. So I'll be frank with you. I've been vegan for over 30 years. And this pandemic has caused me great concern about, obviously, how we treat the environment and specifically animals. In my lifetime, which is, a few decades, several decades, a handful of decades, there's been a ton of these new sort of epidemics, if you will. There's been SARS, Ebola, AIDS, swine flu, MERS, H5N1 is probably one of the same. There's just been a ton of these. And the reason for this is because of the way we treat animals, particularly, and the earth, the natural environment, sort of in aggregate, if you will. So Jonathan Safran Foer, who is a well-known author, has written an opinion piece in the New York Times called "The End of Meat is Here." And the subhead is, if you care about the working poor, about racial justice, and about climate change, you have to stop eating animals. I became vegan because of ethics, so I'm an ethical vegan. And as I said, I've been vegan for just a little over 30 years and find myself in great health. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the Smithfield pork plant, which produces some 5% of the country's pork, is one of the largest hotspots in the nation. So you can see that this is where these things are happening. Obviously, when we put people and animals together in a dense environment, it allows viruses to come across quite easily and for all of us to get infected. And this is how these viruses actually cross species barriers. For example, this latest one, the COVID-19 disease, is caused, they believe, via bats that then infected, I think it was pangolins or some other creatures perhaps, that found its way through a wet market into humanity too. So, there's been a lot of concern over these wet markets in China, but honestly, we have our very own factory farms, which are perhaps even more of a concern as far as these cross-species contamination potential is. And as he says here, animal agriculture is now recognized as a leading cause of global warming. It is tempting to pretend unambiguous science is advocacy. And so what that means is that the science, where we are now with the science, is where we were with smoking about 50 years ago. 50 years ago, we knew that smoking was a killer that caused lung cancer and cardiovascular disease, etc., and yet people didn't want to believe it. And here we are again with talking about veganism. We have a lot of good scientific research, and you can review this document if you like. He points to some of it about the beneficial health aspects of a vegan diet from an environmental perspective, and as well as health, climate change, etc. Now, these are not advocacy. This is science, as he said, and we like to find solace in exceptions that could never be scaled. So, for example, if everybody just ate grass-fed beef, from a family farm, then it would be fine. But the fact of the matter is that we can't. Everybody cannot eat the same quantity of meat as we in North America eat if we were to do such a thing. The best idea is to limit, if not completely go vegan, which is easier enough to do nowadays than it was. We cannot protect our environment while continuing to eat meat regularly, and this is not a refutable perspective, but a banal truism. For example, if cows were a country, they would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. Eating a plant-based diet is the most important contribution every individual can make to reversing global warming. That's true. As I said, I became vegan for ethical reasons. It is known that you don't have to eat meat in order to be healthy. Arguably, you could be at least as healthy as an omnivore on a vegan diet. And if that is the case, then killing animals is just contributing to cruelty and violence unnecessarily, and I didn't want to be a part of that. That's sort of a nutshell of my thinking and why I became vegan. We cannot protect against pandemics while continuing to eat meat regularly. Much attention has been paid to wet markets, but factory farms, specifically poultry farms, are a more important breeding ground for pandemics. And as I mentioned that a little bit earlier. So this is how these things happen. So if we got rid of factory farms, if we severely limited and hopefully eventually eliminated meat, animal products from our diet, we wouldn't have this close interaction in these confined and unhygienic situations we put animals in, which would limit the potential for viruses to be able to cross the species barrier. In a nutshell, that's how it works. These are not my or anyone's opinions, despite a tendency to publish this information in opinion sections, such as they did here with the New York Times. The answers to the most common responses raised by any serious questioning of animal agriculture aren't opinions. So, for example, do we need animal protein? No. We can live longer, healthier lives without it. If we let the factory farm system collapse, won't farmers suffer? No. A family farm is practically a sort of a tale we comfort ourselves with nowadays. Most of it has become big agribusiness. Isn't a movement away from meat elitist? No, we hear this a lot from some of the bleeding hard liberals. A 2015 study found that a vegetarian diet is $750 a year cheaper, and I have found that myself, especially if you're not using a lot of the sort of mock vegan meat products. Those can get a little expensive, but still you probably come out ahead. Can't we work with factory farming corporations to improve the food system? No, we cannot. And the reason for that is this quote from Upton Sinclair that I like to use. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. I think that's very erudite and very smart and insightful as well. Upton Sinclair, interestingly, in 1906, Sinclair acquired particular fame for his classic muckraking novel, The Jungle, which exposed labor and sanitary conditions in the U.S. meatpacking industry, or slaughterhouses, specifically in Chicago, causing a public uproar that contributed in part to the passage a few months later of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act. So I don't think there's any way of getting corporations on board, especially when greed and capitalism are in full worth there. So now we'll just go through a couple of videos here. This article here, this website, Nutrition Facts, is by Dr. Michael Greger. He is a plant-based physician, but he also was a research scientist. And so we'll listen to a couple of things that he has to say. There's a couple of points here that I think are important to understand. So the first comes in at 50 minutes about how we treat animals.
How we treat animals can have global public health implications. It's not surprising then that the American Public Health Association, the largest association of public health professionals in the world, has called for a moratorium on factory farms, urging all federal, state, and local authorities to impose a ban on the building of new intensive livestock operations to protect the health of the local communities in terms of air, water, land contamination, pollution. The prudence of this measure certainly grows with our increasing understanding of the role that these operations play in emerging infectious disease.
So there you go. That's one part of it. How we treat animals obviously is important in understanding our role in these sort of pandemics and these virus creating situations, if you will. And this is science. This is not just, some radical granola chewing, sandal, sock wearing hippie vegans, right? And then we'll go into 5424 and how not using animals will limit these sorts of pandemics. He speaks a little bit more about that.
As the Black Death redirected European history in the 14th century. Hopefully, the direction world history will take is away from raising birds by the billions under intensive confinement, so as to potentially lower our risk of us ever being in this precarious place ever again.
Okay, and lastly, he ends the webinar with a quote from the World Health Organization and their bottom line on how to prevent this. This whole video is worth watching if you like. It came out about 10 years ago. I think it was 2007, maybe 2009. Michael Greger was working for the Humane Society in research pandemic infectious diseases activity of some kind. And I think he used to be an infectious disease sort of researcher at some point. Anyway, let's finish this up and see what he has to say.
Let me end with a quote from the World Health Organization. The bottom line. The bottom line is that humans have to think about how they treat their animals, how they farm them, how they market them. Basically, the whole relationship between the animal kingdom and the human kingdom is coming under stress. In this age of emerging plagues, we now have billions of feathered and curly-tailed test tubes for viruses to incubate and mutate within, billions more spins at pandemic roulette. Along with human culpability, though, comes hope. If changes in human behavior can cause new plagues, well then, changes in human behavior may prevent them in the future.
There you go. So hopefully this has been and this has given you some good thoughts to think about, worth thinking. Okay, let's have some fun with the 8-ball, and let's ask the 8-ball if these thoughts we've been thinking are even making any sense. Okay, let's take a look here. What does the magic 8-ball say? Will one Bitcoin reach $1 million by 2030? Let's see. Without a doubt, there you go. I am obviously a man ahead of my time. If you're going to believe magic 8-balls, let's ask the other question that we were thinking about today. Will the world be vegan by 2050, magic 8-ball? You may rely on it. There you go, folks. You heard it from the magic 8-ball. Magic and mystery. All right, let's finally end with some good news. Here's the good news network. So Captain Tom Moore is overawed after being officially knighted for his $40 million fundraiser. I don't know if you saw this guy. He's probably been making around on the social media. He's a World War II veteran. He's 100 years old now. And he originally started walking around his back garden on April 6th with the intention of raising just 1,000 pounds solely by doing 100 laps before his 100th birthday on April the 30th. Over the course of just 1 month, however, Moore's fundraiser topped a whopping 32 million pounds, 40 million US dollars for National Health Services Charities Together, a new Guinness World Record for money raised on behalf of the healthcare system. There you go. Well done, Tom Moore. He's now been knighted as well at the young age of 100. So Captain Tom Moore doing things and making us think thoughts worth thinking. It's great news. So hopefully you like that, and I'll look forward to speaking with you again. In the meantime, take care, everyone. And remember, Dum Spiro Spero.